There's just something about Halloween which seems to bring out the inner child in all of us. We scream, we laugh, we have a good scare, and then return to life as usual. It's the one time of the year when we are given carte blanche to take our fears and apprehensions a little less seriously. And yet, as we don our funny costumes and whistle in the graveyard, we cannot help but wonder if some of Halloween's ghostly tropes might not have some basis in reality. Inevitably, we find ourselves asking the same question that humanity has been asking itself for centuries. Do you, or do I, really believe in ghosts? As we've seen over the years, West Virginia, like any state in the Union, is blessed, or cursed, with more than its fair share of ghostly yarns of all kinds. It seems somehow apropos that a state born of conflict and turmoil would be the genesis of more than one supernatural tale. I'm not even going to look. In all seriousness, the leaves are changing, the temperature is dropping, and the humidity is finally showing mercy. So Halloween and all of its haunted happenings is once more upon us. This year, we are pleased to present not one or two, but three unique features, each demonstrating the folklore and legends that help to make West Virginia mysterious. Our first feature takes us north to Ritchie County and the ghost town of Silver Run, a former coal mining community with a ghostly tale dating back to the 19th century, and to a time when West Virginia's resources, along with many of its residents, frequently rode the rails. Long before timber and coal became staples of West Virginia's economy, the region from the lower Ohio Valley to the northern Panhandle was offering up its own natural resources. Oil and natural gas were West Virginia's first attempt at adding fuel to America's fires. Beginning in the 1850s, wells of every size and shape began popping up around the state. Situated along the Ohio River, the city of Parkersburg would soon emerge as the economic jumping-off point for goods and resources headed west. However, before anything could be sent west from Parkersburg, it first had to get to Parkersburg. Horses and wagons could do the job. However, distance and terrain made it a slow, perilous trudge. The solution to this problem would soon arrive in the form of wood, steel, and steam. The completion of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad's Southern Line, later dubbed simply the Branch, soon cut the travel time from the Appalachian Mountains to the Ohio River by nearly 80%. The flow of both goods and humanity along its rails would precipitate the birth of many small but strategically important settlements along the line. Between Clarksburg and Parkersburg, the Branch made its way not only around but through many of the obstacles in its path. Mountains which had remained unconquered for eons were soon threaded like needles by more than 20 tunnels and open cuts. From 1857 until 1985, the Branch was one of the most active mainline routes in the United States. Unfortunately, along with a great deal of activity often comes a great deal of trouble. While infinitely superior to the horse and buggy, trains of the 19th century carried with them their own dangers. Derailments, explosions, collisions, and collapses all claimed their fair share of lives over the years. In particular, the area known simply as Silver Run was particularly troublesome. Originally dubbed Tunnel 19, the 19th tunnel in a line headed west, Silver Run was easily one of the longest tunnels along the branch, measuring nearly 1,400 feet from portal to portal. And it is here, at the eastern portal of Tunnel 19, that the legend of the Silver Run ghost was born, a ghost whom locals would soon come to call the White Lady. Most versions of the legend have the first incident occurring in or around 1910, the height of the oil and natural gas boom in northern West Virginia. Traffic along the branch was as heavy as ever. One night, a train was making a regular trek from Grafton to Parkersburg. The stretch of tracks between Clarksburg and Parkersburg runs through mostly rural and sparsely populated regions. Conditions on the best of nights could be as black as a coal mine. As the train headed west, it passed through the once thriving community of Cairo. It exited town and began a slow, sweeping right turn to the northwest. As the brick facade of the number 19 tunnel came into view, the engineer's attention was suddenly drawn to something white in the middle of the tracks. As the powerful light of the locomotive illuminated the surroundings, the engineer's heart nearly stopped. The figure on the tracks was not a something, but a someone. In the harsh light, the engineer saw what appeared to be a young woman clad in a white dress or gown. She seemed completely unaware of the train's presence and was moving in a slow, almost trance-like way. Startled beyond measure, the engineer threw the train's brakes into emergency, but it was too late. As the wheels screeched and slid, the locomotive continued forward for several hundred feet, directly through and over the spot where the engineer had seen the young woman. Once the locomotive finally stopped, the engineer alighted and ran back to the area just beyond the east-facing portal. Fearing the impact with the train's cowcatcher may have flung the woman hundreds of feet away, he searched frantically up one side of the train and down the other. In the meantime, the fireman had also alighted from the train and joined the engineer in his frantic search. Fog was hanging low in the valley leading up to the tunnel, restricting visibility. Neither the engineer nor the fireman found any trace of the woman they had spied walking along the tracks. Hoping and praying that the woman had somehow flung herself clear and fled the scene, the engineer and fireman returned to their posts and got the train underway. Upon reaching Parkersburg, both men reported what had transpired. If any additional searches or inquiry were made into the incident, history seems to be ignorant of them. With no hue and cry or any reports of a missing person, normal operations resumed. However, the next few weeks would be anything but normal. Other engineers making the same run from Grafton to Parkersburg soon began reporting that they too had spied a young woman clad in white just outside the eastern entrance to the Silver Run Tunnel. In each instance, the woman appeared oblivious to the presence of the train. Even the emergency whistle seemed unable to rouse her. In each instance, the engineers were certain that they had run the woman over, yet no trace of her could ever be found. Little by little, a clearer description of the enigmatic woman was formed. She had hair as dark as a raven and was attired in a pale dress, gold slip-on type shoes, and a large brooch which fairly glowed in the light from the locomotive. With her formal attire and slow, deliberate movements, she appeared virtually juxtaposed into the setting. Railroad men were a tight-knit breed, and word of the mysterious woman in white began to circulate among them. It is unknown just what many of the railroaders thought of the reports. Some may have envisioned a ghost or phantom, and others may have conjured up images of a deranged individual who relished in cheating death by inches. Whatever their thoughts, they apparently decided to take no chances. Most westbound engineers began slowing their trains after passing through Cairo and into the valley to the west. According to some versions of the tale, it was at this point that B&O management intervened. Timetables being virtually sacrosanct, the higher-ups cautioned other engineers that anyone slowing or delaying their train for something as preposterous as a ghost would be dismissed. One engineer, a no-nonsense Irishman named O'Flannery, apparently took this dropping of the gauntlet as a challenge. He boldly declared that should he happen upon the lady in white on a westbound run, he would push his locomotive to its limits and run right through her if need be. O'Flannery would not have to wait long to prove his resolve. A few nights later, he indeed found himself as an engineer on a nighttime westbound run. Unsurprisingly, as the train approached the Silver Run Tunnel, the outline of the lady in white came into view. O'Flannery blew his whistle, but made no attempt to slow his speed. Suddenly, the woman on the tracks turned towards the approaching locomotive and screamed in terror. Just as the train should have struck her, she seemed to suddenly fly up into the air and out of sight. O'Flannery was shaken by the incident, but continued on. When he pulled into the station at Parkersburg, he was met by a contingent of B&O workers frantically waving him down. Agents at the Parkersburg yard told O'Flannery that station masters and other civilians along the run between Silver Run and Parkersburg had been calling and telegraphing for the past hour or more. All reported having seen the figure of a human dressed in loose white attire pinned to the front of the train's cowcatcher. Mortified, O'Flannery rushed to the front of the locomotive. Nothing. Not so much as a rabbit, branch, or rock was to be seen. The incident with Engineer O'Flannery prompted Baltimore and Ohio agents to make a more thorough investigation into the matter. Inquiries among residents and workers along the line brought to light a curious tale. Many reported that about 25 years previous, a young woman, whose name was then lost to time, had lived near Silver Run. She reportedly was engaged to be married and was to meet her future husband at the Silver Run station, where they would then catch a train to Parkersburg for the nuptials. She waited, but her fiancé never showed. Her heart apparently broken beyond repair, the young woman, clad in her modest white wedding dress, took to the rails and began walking west along the tracks. Very near the entrance to the Silver Run Tunnel, she was struck and killed by a westbound train. The force of the impact flung her so far into the adjacent woods that her body was never found. Ever since that night, her spirit was said to occasionally appear just outside the tunnel, bound to repeat her last living movements in perpetuity. Decades later, sometime in the 1940s, rumors began to circulate that a cadaver, clad in the remnants of a white dress, had been found in the abandoned cellar of a home situated on the hill above the tunnel. Unaware of who the unfortunate individual was, those who found her quietly buried her in a cemetery a short distance from the Silver Run station. Following this impromptu interment, sightings of the lady in white grew fewer and further between. If anyone ever ascertained her true identity, they never spoke of it. Gradually, the tale of the woman in white grew from mystery to hearsay, and finally into local legend. The legend of Silver Run's Lady in White is an intriguing one that seems to tick all the boxes necessary for a classic haunting, as well as a good campfire story. But is there any real evidence that the incidents described in the legends actually occurred? Sadly, precious little. Those reading or hearing about the legend will quickly note the frustrating lack of full names or consistent dates. The only constant verifiable ingredient is the location. If the one date given, 1910, is to be believed, then this would place the tragic death of the ethereal young woman sometime between 1885 and 1890. A long time ago, to be sure, but not so long ago as to be devoid of documentation. Birth and death records from that time period in West Virginia are surprisingly complete, detailed, and readily available online free of charge. Newspapers from cities and towns in the area are also plentiful and equally as well preserved. And while it is true that newspapers are not infallible and vital records occasionally incomplete, a soon-to-be bride killed after being struck by a B&O train on B&O property is an incident which seems unlikely to have gone unnoticed or underreported. In actuality, an incident of this nature would probably have resulted in front-page headlines, local cries of outrage and anger at the railroad, demands for a full-scale search of the area until the deceased had been located, and, more likely than not, an enormous and well-publicized memorial service for the departed. All of this, in addition to the inevitable years and years of lawsuits, certain to be generated by such a sudden and macabre incident. No, as unromantic as it sounds, the legend of Silver Run's Lady in White is, in all likelihood, a local morality tale, perhaps woven together from various incidents and accidents throughout the years. The obvious lesson being to not play on or near the railroad, and certainly to keep well clear of train tunnels. Wise warnings given the number and severity of documented accidents around Silver Run. With or without the legend of the Lady in White, time around the branch marched on. Gradually, vehicular travel began to displace travel by rail, and most east-west traffic shifted north to the now four-lane U.S. Highway 50. The last regularly scheduled train passed through the Silver Run Tunnel in August of 1985. 2 years later, the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad ceased to exist. Beginning in 1988, the miles and miles of track along the line were taken up. However, the bed upon which the tracks were laid was preserved. In the 1990s, this stretch of railway between Clarksburg and Parkersburg was reborn as the North Bend Rail Trail. Today, steam and diesel power have been replaced by foot and cycle power. Thousands of tourists and locals alike take to its winding route for pleasure and exercise. Many former stations along the old route, including Cairo and Silver Run, have been converted into rest areas. While many of the tunnels along the line were opened or daylighted during the mid-20th century, those that remain today have become especially popular among trailgoers. With its history of tragic accidents and hauntings, the Silver Run Tunnel, Tunnel 19, is perhaps the most frequented of those that remained. Should you have the opportunity, a visit to and a stroll along the North Bend Rail Trail is highly recommended. Should you desire to experience the Silver Run Tunnel for yourself, it is easily reached by foot from the nearby community of Cairo, or by vehicle along Silver Run Road. And, who knows, even your narrator is not infallible. So should you find yourself at the entrance to Tunnel 19 on a cool, misty evening, it couldn't hurt to keep your eyes and ears open. Should you hear the distant, ethereal scream of a young woman, remain calm and pay attention. Should you hear the shrill whistle of an approaching train, well, you're at the wrong tunnel. And unless you want to be the subject of an upcoming feature, you should probably get out of the way. Our next feature takes us eastward along U.S. Route 50 to Harrison County in the city of Clarksburg. Here we examine a tale containing two of the most essential ingredients in any Halloween tale. And West Virginia is blessed with an abundance of both. In fact, it is something of a minor miracle that she is not overrun by haunted houses along twisty, winding roads. Named after the famed frontier general George Rogers Clark, the city of Clarksburg, founded in 1785, began its life as little more than another small hamlet situated on the western slope of the Potomac Highlands. However, as the final quarter of the 19th century commenced, the full might of the Industrial Revolution struck Clarksburg head-on. Fueled by the arrival of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, it was soon transformed into a commercial and economic powerhouse. Here, coal was still king, but glass and timber were strong colonial governors. An enormous influx of Italian immigrants during the late 19th and early 20th century swelled the available workforce and gave Clarksburg a unique style and feel that is evident to this very day. The increase in population and industry brought with them prosperity, and with prosperity came both new businesses and new homes. Fading away were the simple wood-frame dwellings of the antebellum times. On the rise were the large, comfortable houses which soon would come to dot the sidelines of both the roads and rails. Along with the increase in industry came an increase of new residents, along with a general flow of passers-by, people who came to the area to do business, visit with relatives, or perhaps hawk their various wares. According to local legend, one such passer-through was a salesman named Lee Harris. One stormy night, on a routine drive through the area, the vehicle Harris was driving suffered a flat tire. Unable to continue, Harris sought refuge at a nearby home where he had spied a light through one of the windows. Upon ringing the doorbell, Harris was greeted by a lovely young woman. Her stunning beauty reportedly took Harris aback. Her eyes were a brilliant shade of sky blue, and her hair the color of goldenrod. The enchanting woman beckoned Harris in and out of the rain. It was then that Harris was again taken aback by another charming sight. Joining the young woman at the door were three bright-eyed youngsters whom Harris assumed were the woman's children. After the dark of night and the pouring rain, Harris was reportedly deeply moved by the exceedingly warm welcome. Harris used the woman's telephone to contact the nearest auto repair shop. To Harris's dismay, he was told that the storm had damaged a nearby bridge, and it would be impossible to have his tire fixed until at least the next morning. Resigned to his fate, Harris advised the salesman at the repair shop where he was. For some reason, the salesman sounded perplexed and stated that he was under the impression that no one lived at the address Harris had given. Harris confirmed the street and house. With this, the salesman grew more concerned. He advised Harris that something wasn't right, and that he should get out of the house and spend the night in his car if need be. After having received such a warm welcome, Harris dismissed the salesman's warning. He stated that he would be at the described location the following morning and ended the call. The blonde young woman brought Harris a much-appreciated cup of hot coffee and told him that he was more than welcome to stay the night. Relieved at having found sanctuary in such friendly surroundings, Harris gladly accepted. The woman led Harris to a guest room on the home's second floor. Fatigued and feeling not unlike a drowned rat, Harris laid down and soon drifted off to sleep. His slumber apparently went undisturbed until about 30 minutes after the witching hour. It was then that Harris's heavenly sanctuary quickly turned into his own private hell. Harris awoke to the sounds of screaming children, screams that sounded like they were coming from the first floor. Harris initially dismissed the cries as the result of nightmares, but as the screams continued and grew more intense, concern got the better of him. He got up from bed and made his way down to the first floor. He was shocked at the sight which confronted him. There before him was the same young woman who had so graciously welcomed him into her home, yet she seemed to have undergone a shocking transformation. Her golden blonde hair hung in strands, and her once sky-blue eyes had gone sickeningly dark. She now appeared thin as a rail, and her clothes looked as if they had been dragged through the gutter. Her 3 young children looked no better. They now appeared haggard, drained, dirty, and were crying loudly that they were starving. Lee Harris was struck dumb. He approached the young woman and asked what was going on. She did not acknowledge him and continued to plead with her children to stop crying. In a desperate attempt to get her attention, Harris reached out and grabbed the woman's arm. He was shocked when he felt that it was cold as ice. Despite his attempts to calm her, the woman continued to shout at her children, who, in turn, cried even louder that they were dying from hunger. Everything Harris did seemed to be in vain. At one point, the young woman appeared to have reached her breaking point, and she began leading her children through the house and towards a back door. Feeling both helpless and terrified, Harris followed them. Once outside, the woman lined her children up, youngest to oldest, and led them to a nearby well. Realizing what was about to happen, Harris tried to intervene, but was too late. One by one, the woman led her 3 children by the neck and forced them down into the well. Lee Harris tried to grab and stop them, but nothing he did seemed to have any effect. Once the 3 children were gone, the overwrought woman dropped to her knees in prayer. She manically begged God to look after her children. She insisted that she loved them, but that she had been left destitute and could not bear to stand by and let them starve. With a pitiful amen, the woman leapt to her feet, dashed past Harris and back into the home. Harris turned and tried to follow her, but was unable to keep pace. After a quick and frantic search, he found her lying dead upon the floor of the home's kitchen. She had died by her own hand. Harris dashed back up to the room where he had been sleeping and retrieved a blanket from the bed. Intent on covering the young woman's body, Harris returned to the kitchen, only to find that the woman and all vestiges of her gruesome end had vanished. Needless to say, Lee Harris did not get much sleep that night. With the first rays of morning light, the man from the service station arrived at the home. He still expressed disbelief that Harris had actually stayed the night in the home, as he claimed it had been vacant for a long time and was reputed to be haunted. Dodging the question, Harris asked the man if he knew anything about the attractive young woman and her 3 children. The man pled ignorance and again stated that he simply had heard rumors that the house was haunted and that no one had lived in it for more than a year during his lifetime. Thinking back on what he had witnessed, Lee Harris had no trouble believing that his overnight sanctuary had indeed been haunted, and he had more than an inkling as to why. As we will soon see, the tale of the overnight traveler and the haunted lodgings is far from unique. Whether or not this particular rendition of the classic trope is based on an actual occurrence is impossible to ascertain. The tale, as it has been presented here, first appeared amidst a host of other ghost stories in Coffin Hollow, a collection of local legends compiled by noted West Virginia folklorist Ruth Ann Musick. For anyone who attended grammar school in West Virginia after 1971, Ruth's books, if not her name, will probably conjure up more than a few childhood memories. The unmistakable covers of The Telltale Lilac Bush and Coffin Hollow were almost obligatory in any West Virginia library or school. From the late 1940s until her death in 1974, Musick made a concerted effort to collect, preserve, and catalog West Virginia's rich history of folklore and mythology. In particular, she delighted in committing to print the myriad of local tales concerning ghosts, goblins, and other things that go bump in the night. The preceding story, entitled simply The Legend of the Haunted House, appeared as tale number 48 in Coffin Hollow. Ruth's notes indicate that she first heard or read the story in 1965, and that it was reported to have occurred somewhere in Harrison County, not far from Clarksburg. Like most of her printed works, it probably began as a tale written down by one of her many students at Fairmont State University. Ruth never passed judgment on the validity of these stories, and simply took them as they were presented. With regards to its validity, this variation of the overnight traveler motif is particularly difficult to either prove or disprove. We are given no dates and only one name, the name of the unfortunate traveler. And unfortunately for us, he is described as being a salesman who was passing through and not a resident of the area. Though the home alleged to be haunted is described in some detail, no street name or house number is ever given. We are simply told that it is an old abandoned house, white in color, not particularly intimidating, and often surrounded by flowers. Rich in visual beauty, yet frustratingly vague. If the tale has any basis in fact, then there are a few clues offered which allow us to narrow down the time frame somewhat. The salesman is described as traveling through the region by automobile and using a telephone at the home where he stays. Telephones began popping up throughout West Virginia as early as the 1890s. However, travel by auto outside of the cities and towns did not become commonplace until well into the 1920s. Ruth's notes indicate that in 1965, the story was related to her by an individual who claimed to have heard the story from her grandfather. If the story did come from one of her students, then the age of the individual recounting the tale would almost have to have been at least 18. Crunching the numbers liberally, this would most likely place the story sometime no later than the early to mid-1930s. The reference to the young woman being left destitute with 3 children to feed also suggests a date after the onset of the Great Depression. Whether true, partially true, or just another jumble of stories composed into a morality tale, the chilling nature and easily relatable theme of the story offer ample proof, as if any more were needed, that West Virginia is indeed curious. Ha! Gotcha, didn't I? And back to reality. For our third and final feature, we continue our eastward trek along US 50 into the Potomac Highlands and the city of Grafton. Here, we find yet another late-night rover who failed to adequately plan his travel itinerary and found himself seeking shelter in what he thought was an abandoned home. However, in a jolting variation on the previous theme, the fear and terror do not begin within the home, but after the traveler departs. Throughout time, the great Appalachian Mountains have doubled as both an image of beauty and frustration. After the conclusion of the Revolutionary War, getting further west was high on the list of many East Coast residents. In order to move into the Ohio Valley and beyond, travelers had two choices. Take the long northern route through Pennsylvania and then move south along the Ohio River, or dare to cross over and through the Appalachian Mountains. The first major roadway to undertake this challenge was the National Road, which cut through Pennsylvania and across the northern panhandle of Virginia at Wheeling. Over the next few decades, other routes of travel were plotted and carved out. One such shortcut over the Appalachians was the Northwest Turnpike. Completed in 1831, the route, which at times was located entirely within the confines of Virginia, connected the city of Winchester with the Ohio River community of Parkersburg. 25 years later, the Northwestern Virginia Railroad, later purchased by the Baltimore and Ohio, was laid down along essentially the same general path. By the 1870s, travel along this convenient east-west corridor had swelled. Persons and goods moved one way or the other in an almost continuous flow. While the railroad offered a fast and efficient way of getting from one point to another, most travel through the region was still done on horseback. Cheaper and more versatile, but also slower and more dangerous. West Virginia, after all, isn't exactly known for long, flat plains or subtle, rolling hills. Getting around, through, or over its high, rugged mountains can be a daunting challenge. Helping to make the rugged trek a bit more merciful, many inns, taverns, and hostelries sprung up alongside the roadway, and Appalachian hospitality was loath to refuse shelter and safety to a traveler in need. According to legend, one such unlucky traveler began a westward trek along the Northwest Turnpike sometime in the late 1800s. By the time all was said and done, he certainly could not say that his travels had been uneventful. As the story goes, the traveler, whose name was either lost or concealed, began his westward trek on horseback, but at some point along the way, his horse was rendered lame. The unfortunate traveler had no choice but to continue on by foot until another mount could be obtained. At one point, just east of Grafton, West Virginia, his luck went from bad to worse. The skies opened up and let loose a torrential downpour. Not long thereafter, the sun set, leaving him not only waterlogged, but nearly blind. Then, through the darkness, he spotted what he hoped would be his salvation, a fine mansion situated just off the roadway. The traveler trudged up to the front door and knocked. There was no answer. He tried again, and still nothing. He tried the doorknob and, to his amazement, found it unlocked. Stepping into the home and out of the elements, the weary traveler noted that the rooms appeared to be neat and furnished, and yet there was no sign of recent habitation. Thinking the home had likely been deserted, the traveler made his way to the first comfortable chair he could find. He leaned back and made ready to go to sleep. An instant later, a grandfather clock chimed, signaling to all within earshot that it was midnight. 12 tolls later, the traveler was suddenly startled to find that he was no longer alone. Descending a nearby staircase was a young woman with lantern in hand. Jolted by her appearance, the traveler hurriedly explained his predicament and that he had found the front door unlocked and unbarred. The girl did not appear angered or afraid. She spoke not a word, but simply smiled warmly at the traveler before tipping her head and exiting into an adjacent room. Moments later, she reappeared, a tray of warm food and a cup of hot coffee in hand. The traveler's spirits rose as he realized that he would not have to venture back out into the elements. The woman kindly gestured at the tray, indicating that it was for the traveler, and then handed him the inviting cup of hot coffee. The young woman remained silent as the traveler consumed his meal. Thinking she was perhaps mute, he did not address the issue, but merely returned her warm smile with one of his own. Once the traveler had finished his meal, the young woman rose and collected the tray. Once more she smiled warmly at her more than grateful guest, before once more slipping away into another room. The traveler allowed his food to digest, but soon realized that the woman had never returned or gone back up the steps. He checked the room into which the woman had twice entered, found it to be the home's kitchen, but again the woman was nowhere to be seen. Thinking she must have exited by some other means, perhaps a concealed staircase for the servants, the traveler returned to his chair and soon fell asleep. The morning dawned clear and bright. Upon opening his eyes, the traveler was once again met with the kindly smile of his young host, as well as another tray of warm food. Upon finishing his meal, the traveler prepared to depart. Eternally grateful for her hospitality, the traveler advised her to seek him out should she ever find herself in need of help. With that, the traveler left his residence and continued his westward journey. However, his heart, which had been buoyed by the kind treatment he had received, was soon to plummet. As he neared the outskirts of Grafton, he found himself met not by a contingent of Appalachian hospitality, but rather by an angry mob. In short order, the traveler was escorted to the sheriff's office. Here, he was informed by the sheriff that an elderly man had been beaten badly during the night, and that all persons in the area were being called upon to account for their whereabouts. When asked about his actions the previous night, the traveler calmly explained how he had taken shelter in the large home outside of town. The traveler's confidence evaporated as the sheriff firmly declared that such an alibi simply did not hold water. Reason being, the only large white home anywhere near the described location belonged to a family by the name of Cathcart, and had burned to the ground 5 years earlier. Stymied, yet resolute, the traveler held true to his story, and suggested to the sheriff that if he doubted his word, then the pair should, together, pay a visit to the residence in question. Wanting to give the young traveler the benefit of the doubt, the sheriff agreed. The two men departed town in a horse and buggy, and began retracing the route the traveler claimed to have taken. However, the traveler's heart sunk to its lowest when they arrived at the location he clearly recalled, only to find nothing more than a lone brick chimney standing upright in an empty lot. His thoughts whirling like a dervish, the traveler racked his brains for some explanation, but all in vain. As the pair rode back towards Grafton, the sheriff explained that the white mansion the traveler was describing had once belonged to a man named Hamilton Cathcart, who had lived there with his young daughter, Melissa. A little over 5 years previous, Hamilton had gotten into some kind of dispute with his closest neighbor, a man named Charlie Pickens, Sr., over an alleged romance between Melissa and Charlie Pickens, Jr. Old Man Pickens apparently disapproved, as it was rumored that Melissa Cathcart was, as the saying was at the time, touched in the head. Not long thereafter, the mansion where the Cathcarts lived caught fire and burned to the ground, taking Hamilton and Melissa Cathcart with it. Rumors began flying that Charlie Pickens Sr. was responsible for the blaze, but no evidence against him could ever be found. When asked what had become of Mr. Pickens, the sheriff, with a distinct note of irony, advised that it was he who had been severely beaten the night before. Reluctantly, the sheriff lamented that should Old Man Pickens succumb to his injuries, then he would have no choice but to have the traveler indicted for murder. By now, grasping at any straw within reach, the traveler asked if the pair could pay a visit to the hospital where Charlie Pickens Sr. was convalescing. Equally curious about the traveler's account and the double murders 5 years previous, the sheriff agreed. Upon arriving at the hospital, the men were hurriedly greeted by several members of the Pickens family. Strangely, they advised the sheriff that Charlie Sr. had been asking for him as if it were a matter of life and death. The sheriff and traveler went to Charlie's bedside. Without hesitation, Charlie Pickens is said to have declared that the traveler was innocent. He then confessed that he was, indeed, the one who had set fire to the Cathcart's home, and that his current condition was a result of Hamilton Cathcart fulfilling a dying promise to get even. With that, Charlie Pickens Sr. is said to have exited this world. Word later spread that following his confession, his body had experienced some bizarre type of spontaneous combustion and been burned almost beyond recognition. However he departed, Charlie Pickens was dead, and the traveler a free man. The tale of the wayfaring traveler given shelter by hosts who were later revealed to be ethereal is quite common. Much like last year's tale of the Fifth Street hitchhiker, it is a motif that has seen and undergone many variations over the centuries. Here again, the validity of the tale is difficult to quantify. Like the previous tale, this particular story of the traveler and his misfortunes made its popular culture debut in the 1977 publication Coffin Hollow. According to Ruth Music's notes, the tale was first presented to her in 1965, most likely by one of her students at Fairmont State College. The brief notation indicates that the legend was imparted to the original author, a resident of Grafton, by an individual described as an old lady who was a lifelong resident of the Grafton area. According to this unnamed source, the traveler in the story was her grandfather. Curiously, Grafton itself is never actually mentioned in the written narrative. In addition to this, no date is given, and many key participants are left unnamed. In all candor, it is never even stated that the story actually took place in West Virginia. Accepting for the moment that the story was reported accurately, we can make a couple of reasonable deductions based upon the notes provided. 1. The town the traveler entered was Grafton, the county seat of Taylor County, West Virginia. This is substantiated by the cited residence of the author and his source, as well as the designation of the law enforcement official as a sheriff. In West Virginia, any sheriff would be employed at the county level and would be stationed in the county seat, in this instance, Grafton. 2. If Grafton and its outskirts was the setting, then the road the traveler was using would, in all likelihood, have been the old Northwestern Turnpike. 3. If both the traveler and the sheriff were using horses as their primary means of travel, then the events likely took place sometime prior to the year 1920. As for any documentation corroborating the reported events, sadly, once again, none could be found. A diligent check of U.S. Census records from 1850 through 1920 found no one by the name of Hamilton Cathcart with a daughter named Melissa living in West Virginia or anywhere else in the United States. The same holds true for Charlie Pickens, Jr. and Sr. Searches of deeds, birth and death records, wills, and newspapers returned equally disappointing results. Clearly, the names given by the author in 1965 could have been changed for one reason or another, although such alterations to folklore tales are usually noted, if only to heighten the mystery. Here again, the volume of evidence once more points to a morality tale, most likely cobbled together from any number of loosely connected incidents. Deaths in home fires were, and still are, not at all uncommon. Deathbed confessions do occur. Late-night travelers have been known to seek out the nearest port in the storm, and, likely as not, many of them came to regret it. Finally, as to a parent disapproving of a youthful romance, well, perhaps enough said. Romeo and Juliet didn't exactly have a happy ending either. Whether or not they have any basis in historic fact, the stories we have presented here all have at least one thing in common: words of caution. Always plan before you travel. Never walk along active railroad tracks. Always check your tires before driving long distances. Beware smiling faces bearing gifts. And, above all, when it comes to overnight lodgings, please stick to hotels and motels where you know you will be safe. Over where? And here's another moral lesson to conjure with. No one likes a smart. And on that almost obscene note, I sincerely wish all of you a happy and safe Halloween. Good night and good luck. Or was it, good night out there, whatever you are? No? Say good night, Dick. No? So long, farewell, la vida zena dux. Ciao for now. See ya. Bye. Yeah. Well, how about cut? Yeah, that's right. Just like that. Cut. Oh, well. I never wanted to be a barber anyway. I wanted to be a lumberjack, leaping from tree to